Diana, congratulations on the new book, and it's good to see you. I didn't. It's been too long since you and I spoke.
Yes, yes, it's wonderful to be back with you, Mike. It's been a tumultuous, I don't know, 100 and something days, right?
Unbelievable. And a lot of times I have to look up and see when the last time I spoke with somebody was, and I didn't have to do that because I think to our conversation, it was the day after the election. For people that don't know, I think back to it a lot, and actually I took one of the clips from that conversation and immediately put that out there, and I have it in my head a lot what you said the day after because something to me did not feel right. I mean, I was obviously glad Trump won. I voted for him, but it just didn't feel right. And people were celebrating and like it was over. Like everything was over and you could go back to the couch and your lattes and what have you. And you had said this is the and I'm paraphrasing here, but like the next step of the revolution.
Next cycle,
Next cycle.
next
Step
cycle,
or
right?
cycle.
Yeah,
And this by no means was over.
right, right. We all want it to be over. I think that's a big part of it. You want to get to a safe place, but no, we didn't, did we?
So how do you feel now about things?
Well, it's almost like there's a schizophrenic way to be aware of what's going on. There are a lot of positive effort, steps, agenda, strength coming out of the White House, and yet there's this undercurrent and this personnel problem and this the judicial revolution. Talk about revolution, but the judicial seizure of power, the lack of balance of power that we have with an utterly vacant Congress, right, and this ramped up judiciary. But I like the deportations. I like the efforts to bring things under control. I like the tariffs. I like a lot of these agendas and voted for them. This isn't a surprise, right? This is what he was campaigning on. And I would say that a lot of what he is trying to do is simply restore a functioning nation state that controls its borders and manufacturing and all the rest of it. I mean, these are restorative efforts. They're treated as so wild and crazy in the sort of entrenched revolutionary media and political class and so on. But they are, of course, undermining with language things that are really should be seen as basics that are necessary to function as a nation state. So there's that going on, very difficult. I think a lot about the toll it must be taking on Trump as he comes up to his 79th birthday. I mean, vital, vigorous, on the job, and all the rest of it, unlike our last experience with the presidency, of course, but still, he's one man, and it's so you think about that. And then you also were perplexed. Once again, we have this ring of people around the president that um, is very, it seems to me, detrimental to the agenda as stated. So we're once again in that conundrum, even if he seems to be more explosive out of the box with what he's trying to do.
Well, and that's where, first of all, he is the most resilient guy that I've ever seen in my life. And
Oh, his epic Beowulf, I think I've called it before. Yes.
and he is a phenomenon. And I use the comparison to, from a sports standpoint, Michael Jordan or Muhammad Ali. We're never going to see this in our political front ever again.
Right, right.
I mean,
I
the
think
guy
that's
just doesn't give up. He just he just doesn't
right.
quit.
No, it's he is his courage. I think his fortitude. I mean, these are um, historic. You can't really get the superlatives at the level of his performance and his effort and his, as you say, resilience. So yeah, we will never see his like, and you wonder what comes after, and you wonder what he will be able to do that will have any lasting impact. So it's a very unnerving period we're in if you see past some of the banners or some of the happy talk or some of the kind of the general frou-frou. I mean, I think I saw Ann Coulter say it was the greatest 100 days in American history. And I would agree with her on one level. And yet it also was the most terrifying, it is still the most terrifying 100 days in American history, because there is no, it's like watching the water roll out and roll in at the beach or something. I mean, there's so much, there's so much struggle and strife with every step that we're taking. So it's hard.
Yeah, I agree, and I've been using the saying, "There's like so much going on, but yet nothing is happening at the same time
Right.
simultaneously."
Exactly. So what is going, right? That's really exactly it. Yes.
Like you think things are imminent, and then it's like for example, war with Iran. It seems like that's going to happen, but it seems like we've been on the brink of that for so long, and
So
it
long.
doesn't happen, right?
Or even more in a more almost mundane way, the staff at the DEI staff at Voice of America or some other agency is fired, and then a judge puts them back or orders them back, or there's just so much push me pull you going on that it is hard to take stock of what is actually happening. We seem to be coming down to deportations of gang members and select pro-Hamas agitators, that kind of thing. But how much can be done? What kind of staff does Tom Homan have? I've heard that he does not have enough staff. They're just all these cross-purpose signals going on, and an awful lot of propaganda and reshaping kind of the information space going on as well. I'm very nervous about the continued slander of Trump as a fascist, as a Nazi, as being unconstitutional, etc. This kind of branding is very dangerous when you combine it with the very strong, openly revolutionary, openly, to use a word, insurrectionist attitudes of shadow Democrat governments, of organizations like People's Forum and so on, that are mobilizing people. We just had an election, a decisive election, several months ago, not even 6 months ago, and the recent rallies around the country. They are presenting our situation as being some kind of authoritarian dictatorship when we literally had an election months ago. So, there's just an awful lot of propaganda that looks to me like preparation for possibly very dangerous things. Will we see impeachment coming forward? Will we see, protests that, grow and dig in? And, what kind of summer are we going to have? I guess we'll have to check in on that. There's a lot of dangerous energy that seems to be coalescing to fight this effort to basically restore the nation state.
This episode is brought to you by McElvaney Financial Group. Their advisors bring a depth of knowledge and experience that allow them to serve their clientele with care, ensuring their financial needs are met now and in the future. Personally, I'm not saying cash is worthless, but you can see what's happening. It's worth less every year. Gold is the opposite. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to www.mcelvaney.com/coffeeandamike. Do you think it can be restored, Diana? I mean, you're somebody I consider, a historian. You've written, American Betrayal, World War II prior, and see the steps to get to where we're at now. Do you think these institutions can be restored?
Well, it's if they can be, it requires so much exposure and education and understanding on the part of the populace. It requires so much replacement of these bureaucracies that have had generations to dig in as subversive forces, whether it's State Department or Defense Department or wherever they are. Our government, as we've seen, has become this force for totalitarian leftist control. So how does one man, and has he lined up the people to take this on? Is it really happening when we believe it is? These are our questions. I'm pretty gloomy about I hate saying no, because of course,
We
really,
feel the
what do
same.
any of us know? But it seems that our systems are so broken, and that Trump, as this singular figure, is able to have come in, or however that happened, or can was allowed to happen. I don't even know anymore. I think the big problem for me, Mike, I don't mean to ramble, but the big problem is there's so much hidden from us. There's so little, as the word is, transparency on anything, and there's so much distraction. Whether it's they're dangling JFK files or Epstein files in front of there's so much effort to completely, they went that away us all the time. So it becomes very hard to believe that there is a real serious effort to expose and rectify and punish what has gone on. And I would take a place. I am disappointed, or maybe disappointed is not the word, but where things have not gone well yet, and that would be with regard to January 6th. We got the pretty much blanket pardon. I think the commutations have now turned into pardons that were lingering. I don't want to minimize if there's anyone left in jail. So there may be some still in jail. I'm not totally aware, but basically we've got 99%, I think, out and pardoned right away, and that was fantastic. But it's like the rest of the administration turned the page. And so when you see that there is no effort to expose what happened to these Americans who went to the Capitol on January 6, 2021, that is dangerous to me. And when you see, for example, um, a failure to recognize, I mean, if I've been reading, strangely enough, I've been reading some French history about some of the coups d'etats that they suffered in the 19th century. Victor Hugo wrote this amazing book, believe it or not. I had no idea. It was called something like, what is it called? Something like Story of a Crime. And it was about the seizure of power from the Republic in 1851 by Louis Napoleon. And it's this forensic description of how he was a legislator at the time, and it's this forensic description of where the army went, where the people went, where they put the. I mean, it's kind of an amazing thing. And I was reading through this, and you know how the French are always striking off medals and uniforms and hats, and they have this great style. And I was thinking, along French terms, our January Sixers should have had a medal struck for them, should be recognized. There should be restitution. They should be paid back on the damages done. I mean, one of the I have one January 6th story in the new book, how to what is it called? Wake Up and Smell the Culture. And it was a story I'd followed of Thomas Caldwell, who was a veteran naval commander who was arrested with the FBI raid on his small farm in Virginia, and they used a battering ram. And one of the details that one of the just little things that happened, it wasn't little to him, but one of the details was they used this battering ram on his barn where his prized cherry 1963 T-Bird was parked, and they hurt it. They bashed it needlessly. And I was just thinking, that car should be fixed. Do you know what I mean? It's like they pardoned them almost to get them off the table as a political issue. And then, oh, well, we're not going to do anything. And then, of course, I'm sure, as you heard, Kash Patel promoted one of the anti-J6 FBI honchos to be head of the Washington FBI office. So there's something bad going on with that.
Well, and Pam Bondi, that was, she was all over the news talking about Epstein. Oh, they're on my desk. I threw something out there. It was like a random Friday. I go, I wonder if we're going to get the Epstein files today. Just because she's out there, talking about it, and then nothing.
Nothing. And again, distraction, deflection, and then creating embarrassment. Pam Bondi should never have been appointed attorney. It's once again, how did these happen? I mean, I would much I mean, I think things would look very different if Matt Gaetz were Attorney General. I'm so sorry that he was, it seems like he was almost offed on purpose to get him off out of power and someplace else in media. But Pam Bondi is known for her help in creating the whole George Zimmerman fiasco in Florida, in terms of creating a case that should never have been brought to prosecute George Zimmerman in the death of Trayvon Martin, going back some years now. But that was Pam Bondi. And what was she? Also, was she on the payroll as a lobbyist for Qatar? This is, how does this happen? You just wonder what is going on. Who are these people once again surrounding Trump? Did he pick them? Did they envelop him? In terms of communist history, it is always a tactic of communists to envelop the talent, to try to enter into the circle of the star mover and shaker. Is that what happened? Is Trump clueless? These are, again, these perplexing questions that we always have. And really, nobody really knows the answer unless they are extremely close to the president and to these people. You can't know these things as a citizen watching the spectacle. So more of this perplexity.
Well, and this is a question that I asked myself. When you look back at the election, not to spend a lot of time on that, but how did all these big tech people, they did everything they could to get rid of him in 2020,
right?
And they came behind him this go around, and why? Right. And I've heard the argument. People will say, well, the people stood up and spoke and made the statement. I don't doubt that, obviously, but they also did that in 2020, and I believe it was stolen. My opinion, right? And did big tech this time around not let the other side cheat? And that's what I think. I mean, again, I'm just way on the outside of this, but it makes the most sense to me.
Yeah. And I saw an interesting, I think it was Jerry Corsi wrote an article about that they decided to let the presidential go, and they cheated like crazy in the Congress to make sure it was a very narrow margin for Republicans. That was his theory, which was kind of interesting. He had some data, behind that too, which I don't recall. But why did big tech come to Trump? Well, you go to the winner. They went to the winner. They didn't. I think it was there were certainly seemed to be motivations like that, but again, also to undermine, to learn, to burrow into the America First world, which big tech is antithetical to. Anything that is about individual liberty is at odds with big tech. Has to be. So it's very sinister. It was very disturbing. They parked themselves at Mar-a-Lago, right?
Literally parked themselves at Mar-a-Lago. When I kept seeing Elon, Thanksgiving, he's there. Yeah. It's like this guy runs 7 corporations. There's got to be something else for him to do.
Right. Well, it's always this double-edged sword watching the Trump years unfold, I think. And you don't understand what's going on, then, I'm perfectly happy to see Doge cut these DEI programs and USAID down to the bone or close the doors. But of course, when you back up a minute and you think, hey, wait a minute, Congress was supposed to be doing this all along. I mean, they're supposed to be watching the money and making sure that it's not wasted and abused in this way. Of course, obviously, Congress is non-functional. They should really cut Congress at this point. I mean, seriously, it's so in the tank for all of these things. But it's just what really bothered me a lot was on Inauguration Day when we were inside because it was too cold to be outside. So they're in that beautiful hall, and when you looked at the family and friends in a couple of tiers on behind Donald Trump and behind the podium, it was the cabinet, and then it was the tech bros, right? And then it was the family members. So it was like a class, looked like a grammar school class dais or something. That's how they were arranged. And it was so disturbing. I don't know. People say we're still en route for digital currency and all the rest of that. So are we getting MAGA with, all this stuff underneath? It's very hard to really understand. That does seem to be what is probably going to happen. So will things improve? Will we have better certain quality of life, perhaps better certain, our showers will be better and things like that. And, we'll get rid of some of these gang members, but we will go to digital grids and things like that anyway. Is there any way to stop that? Is that why the tech bros were in there?
I think it's inevitable, and at this point, people get. I'm trying not to read comments anymore with stuff
Mm,
because as you know, you get the trolls and what have you, and
yeah,
somebody wrote how I'm all for a CBDC, and I'm not saying that, but you do everything on your phone now, literally everything. You pay bills on your phone, you check into airports on your phone, your boarding pass, everything is done on your phone. That is the foundation for the digital passport.
it is. It is, but you don't have to. I
But
mean, it became, I do, I, well, I'm not a good example because I'm not really functioning in the same way a lot of people are, but I got rid of my phone during COVID. It so unnerved me, the whole idea of tracking and all the rest of it. And I think that it's very hard to get people to abandon the convenience and the all the rest of it that goes with the phone unless they start becoming sensitized to the notion of being tracked, of having everything quantified, of being during COVID Australia seemed to be the control experiment on tracking people's travel. They were trying to keep people within certain kinds of limits travel wise, and that would be something that would not be possible if we were not in using phones, using smart cars, all the rest of it. So, but that requires an awful lot of effort on the part of people, right, to abandon this convenience. But honestly, we did used to function without these things, and that does beg a lot of questions about how do you completely reverse um, all this infrastructure and such that supports it and encourages it and creates it and all the rest of it. So an uphill battle that is very hard to imagine winning. But on the other hand, if we ever have, God forbid, one of these terrible attacks that completely take out our grids, people are going to have to learn to do things without this technology.
and that's the only way to me at this point because
Yeah.
you and I knew a different world, without technology. I mean, I'm part of the
Mhm.
last generation of kids that played outside.
Right.
And I think, this new direction that wherever this goes, right? I mean, Scott Bissett was on earlier today. I didn't get a chance to watch it, but we're definitely moving into, in my view, a new financial system, whatever that is. And he's talked about that, like wanting to be at the table of wherever we're going. And my concern is when you talk about phones. I mean, I maybe it's me just getting older, Diana, but when I'm driving, I don't know if you notice this. When I'm driving, I have to be so cognizant of people walking across the street because they're looking at their phones.
They're look exactly. No, it's so true. It's so true. No, I think that a lot of this. I mean, this is not particularly original, but I think a lot of this is we're watching the creation of the hybrid human. I mean, the whole notion of transhumanism and the human machine, and the combinations. I mean, this is all kind of training for metaverse, the metaverse and the practice metaverse, I guess. And it's obviously unwieldy because people are holding phones and staring at them. But at some point, all these things will probably be implants, right, and all the rest of it. So this is just creating that expectation. I think there's so much dulling of the brain that's gone on for so many different reasons, that we're all subject to because of these technologies and all the rest of it. So um, it creates, thinking outside the swarm becomes harder and harder. Um, and again, that is sort of Trump also is a generational figure at age, what is he's turning 79, I think, in June. It is a generation that is leaving us, right? And, we've already been left by the older generation, the World War II generation, et cetera, that people saw the Depression. It's like, there's just all this knowledge of another way and another human that's disappearing. So yeah, we're into something that is definitely well, it's quite sinister to me. But maybe people who are younger, in a few years, will just think it's fantastic because of all the possibilities. But
And they don't know any different. So that's why I don't see the
yeah,
fight from that younger generation
no. Well,
because
there are some. I mean, there are people, I think there is a tiny back to nature type family movement. There is, that does exist. People who really are literally, well, Latin mass Catholics, farming, kids on the farm. There is a small world out there that networks with itself, um, outside the Amish. The Amish would be, of course, a something, a display of that, in the most extreme way, completely anti-modern. But I don't know. I think some people will probably attempt to find their way off the grid, but again, it will be harder, and it will involve an awful lot of loss. But on the other hand, the way the cities are going, they're not as alluring as they used to be for for excitement and enrichment. I mean, it's just over. The cities are over.
you think so?
I do. I mean, as far as when I compare, I went to New York City when I graduated from college, and this would be in the '80s, and it was exciting, and it was amazing, the people you could see and meet and watch, and things you could do. I mean, it was amazing, and it was not. It was a very look. The demographic, probably when I arrived in New York City, I'm going to guess. I would say the city was probably somewhere between 80% white. I would guess, maybe a little. I would say that's probably true. I recently saw demographics. And if you remember, do you remember the ball player? There was a pitcher who came to New York City around this time, and he made a comment. He was playing in at the Mets or something like that. He might have been a Met. I'm not sure if he was a New York player or not. But anyway, he came. He made huge headlines. He got whacked to pieces because he pointed out that he could not hear English on a crosstown metro in New York, or subway in New York City. And that was a big sort of turning point for New York. Demographically, things change. Things change. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I will tell you a story that you will not believe, which is I grew up in the 60s. And when I was a little girl, my mom in LA, we were in West LA, we lived in Laurel Canyon. And I remember once or twice my mom wanting to take my brother and me to see like folkloric Mexican dancing around Cinco de Mayo or something, because you had to go somewhere. You had to go somewhere in Los Angeles to find Mexican culture. It wasn't a Mexican city. It was a white city. I mean, it was very much homogeneously white for, I mean, I would say probably into, 1980 or something like that, when, demographics really began to change. That is something that nobody will understand who's raised in cities today. I mean, can you imagine? I think we drove to Santa Barbara one year. We went down to Alvaro Street, which is the downtown section of LA. And I do remember that because when I was, I guess when Lou Dobbs, do you remember Lou Dobbs, with his old CNN show? I was a regular on his show as a pundit. And I think it was because I told this story, and also was talking about immigration. This would have been, back in the the Son administration. I was talking about America, the honeypot. You had to stop the honeypot to stop all this illegal immigration. And that kind of got me a ticket onto his show. He liked that image a lot, but he was amazed, when I told him this story. So
When was the last time you were in either one of those cities?
I'm sorry,
When was the last time you were in it? You were in LA or New York?
LA or New York? I was in New York before COVID. I haven't been to New York since then. And I spent most of my adult life in Washington, but LA, it's been probably about 10 years since I've been to LA.
No desire to go at this point?
I love Los Angeles, but
I do
that Los
too.
Angeles,
I do too, Diana.
Yeah, the Los Angeles I grew up in is was very was was truly a like an idyllic place. The hills were very undeveloped. There was still open, well, there still is some places, but there was just it was a much smaller place. And my dad was a writer, and he worked in the Hollywood movie and TV industry, and so I was very aware of the Hollywood history, and it was a very magical place. It's so changed. I've been back I would say probably not for 10 years. I think I went back the last time with American Betrayal, so that's about 10 years ago. Um, it's so different. It doesn't pull me as much, except when you have that feeling of the sea and the air and the oleander and the sky. I mean, it's a lovely spot. It really is a beautiful place when you can find the still scenic areas.
I don't think I realized your dad was in the Hollywood space.
Yes, yes, he was a novelist. That's what he mainly enjoyed doing. But no, he read a lot of TV and such.
Any TV I would know?
Well, he wrote for Lou Grant. If you remember that show, I think he had a show or two on that. And oh gosh, going back to early days of TV as well. He started in New York City actually before everything went out to Hollywood. Old Danger and Alfred Hitchcock. Some of those kinds of shows. Playhouse. I'm trying to remember. I can't off the top of my head, but yeah, he worked a lot in that space. And while he was writing, really wanted to write novels.
And it seems to me that, I don't know what the future of Hollywood is, but I was talking to somebody. I used to love like the superhero movies as a kid, and I was never a comic book reader or anything, but we were talking about some of the movies that are coming out this summer, and one of the Disney trailers, it showed the villain is typically a male, and they have it as a female in this, and I'm like,
Oh, yeah, of
they're
course.
still they're still
Pushing it. Yeah. But it was very effective. What they did was so effective. My dad was a conservative in Hollywood, and this would have been, the 60s and 70s. I remember the arguments, Vietnam, the students, Nixon. These were things I heard yelled at. They're yelling in the downstairs after dinner in the living room, sitting on the staircase, literally, and listening. It was a very political place. It became I guess everything became very political. But the earlier days interested me quite a lot, and I've written about some of that. Some of that's in American Betrayal as well, which was this essentially understanding the importance of mass media and the communist move infiltration of these tools infiltrating Hollywood. And one of the things that I found very interesting, it wasn't so much putting propaganda into movies, which is what people tend to look for. Dalton Trumbo, who's famously one of the Hollywood 10, he was communist. He at one point was discussing the importance of what they were able to keep off the screen. So again, omission, what the kinds of stories they were able to prevent American mass culture from seeing, anti-communist stories, big books, big, whether it was Darkness at Noon or some of the other properties of the day that told the story of the Bolshevik Revolution and so on. There were very few Hollywood movies that got into this. There were a few, and depending on who was in charge at the time, but basically that was what they were tasked with, and so they did shape this population that became increasingly ignorant. And then, of course, what you're talking about is where we go now in terms of the total destruction of what it is to be human, basically, which I think is kind of behind a lot of the trends, propaganda and control that we're seeing now. There's this effort to completely erase whatever is intrinsically human about us as men and women and children. So that's the new frontier, or it's not so new anymore, but that is, I think, what we see.
Do you think in relation to Hollywood, where you had movies that came across 70s, 80s, 90s, where it appeared to be that Americano patriotic feel. Did they let that slip through, or was that done intentionally?
What do you mean exactly?
Like when you would see a movie that would be like patriotic or
Mhm.
symbolization of freedom in the United States and greatest country in the world type of thing. Do you think that they allowed that to get through to kind of they could slip their messaging through other channels by putting out this other
Yeah.
stuff?
Well, I mean, I think that there wasn't ever total control of anything. This would be um, efforts that would probably become very focused on trying to infiltrate a certain storyline or stop a certain storyline from getting to the screen. Um, a lot of the kinds of, if you think of World War II movies, which were very propagandistic because we were in a war, I think that those were very helpful to the whole communist cause, as you know from American Betrayal, given the need for that war to be fought, to continue on and on and on, would help. My thesis being it all helped communist expansion. We were taught, and the movies teach us, we were triumphing over Nazism and making the world safe and destroying this evil ideology. And yet, the whole time through, the Americans, the British, the Nazi government as well, the Japanese government as well, completely infiltrated, subverted by communist agents. And so the entire strategy becomes something to work through to create the result we see after World War II, which is the rise of communist global institutions like the UN and the IMF and World Bank and so on. And of course, the communization of half of Europe, China, and then the complete Marxification of our education system. So all of these things are directly linkable to what happened in World War II. So yeah, rah rah World War II. It's again another one of these messaging conundrums, I guess.
When you reading American Betrayal, it made me think to ask you when you were writing it, and you look at fast forward to where we are today, and even with your recent book, you know, infiltrating with communism in all these very institutions all over the world. And
Yeah.
did you ever envision like where we sit today? Because I feel like it's had so much time now to just get entrenched everywhere.
Yeah, no, I did not envision what we are sitting with today. I
What
think
did you
that,
envision, Diana? Not to interrupt you, but what did you
yeah,
envision?
what did I envision? I thought it would be more manageable. I used to think I've been I'm not really a historian. I mean, I'm a journalist, and I spent most of my career, making a weekly deadline on a syndicated column for many years. Worked at newspaper, Washington Times News, other lots of journals, freelancing, and so on. And I've written these books, but I used to believe that what I wrote, what other people wrote, would have an impact on the direction of everything. I mean, it's not a megalomaniacal thing, but it's an idea that thinking that words matter, that debate matters, that people can be moved by the truth or what you are trying to seek. I've always, really tried to seek the truth, the facts, and that sort of has dictated a lot of what I've written because very often I'm trying to see through narratives or stories that are obviously foisted on us for nefarious purposes or distraction purposes, things like that. So that's kind of where I come from in terms of what I choose to write about. But I did believe that if you just put the facts, for example, about Islamic law in front of people, it would have an impact, and that you might see an effort to use immigration to prevent Islamic law from getting a demographic in this country, let us say, or in a European country, and so on. And it didn't. There were just I think there was just this what I did not realize at all when I was a young person starting out, and really took quite a while to get to, is how rigged so much of these different supposed democracies are and have been, and how hard it is to get the popular will enacted. I guess that's the main thing. And so if you're a journalist and you're trying to put ideas out that will have an impact in the popular understanding of events, it's a sad day when it seems to be that is just not really possible. And I think that where we are now, on the one hand, with social media, is yay, we can all create, but it's a big control grid. It really is a big control grid about who is going to emerge as what they call an influencer, or a dominant podcaster, or whatever it is. It seems like these are decisions that are not truly due to popularity, because people don't get a chance. I don't think people are getting a chance to be popular or not popular. I think at the beginning, maybe of Twitter and so on, I think there was sort of a Wild West quality, and maybe it hadn't really gelled. But at this point, it seems like there is such a clear, like a circus ring that certain people may perform inside. And if you're talking about things that are outside the ring, you're going to be outside the ring with them. And I think that was something I did not envision. I also didn't. I never would have envisioned the popular expression of support for terrorism that we've seen since October 7th in Western cities. I remember so distinctly 9/11. It would be as if 9/11 had engendered similar kinds of protests in favor of whatever it was Al Qaeda was, had on their political agenda. Let us say, there's just been a sea change, and it comes down to Islamization. It comes down to further Marxification, further erasure of our kind of moral standards, a very big increase, whether people understand it, in moral relativism. There's just so much moral relativism. Nothing is beyond the pale, except for maybe certain things that we might talk about. That gets beyond the pale. But things that have been traditional guideposts are gone. And think about it. The idea that we could live in a country where young girls and young women are being forced by the authorities, by the schools, by the sports associations, by the governors, to play with men and boys I would never have imagined. Would you have imagined that?
I got crucified on my personal Facebook the night before. I said, if you're voting for Kamala Harris, you're voting for boys and girls bathrooms. Diana, I can't tell you how much vitriol I got for putting that up there. Oh, yeah. And people that I know.
Was it because they didn't believe it, or because they thought it was terrible that you didn't like that?
They were saying, I'll quote you here, people were saying, that's bullshit. I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And then I had people saying that I was attacking the trans community. I said, how am I attacking the trans? Like, how is that possible? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of what are you talking about going around, right? I mean, I think it's very hard to have conversations. And that's another thing that I think has changed quite a lot. Even when you go back to, again, listening as a kid to some of the arguments in my parents' house over Vietnam or something, I think I think that the left had more arguments back then. I may be misremembering, but it seemed like there was more cogent argument going on. That could be, I'm not sure if that's true, but that strikes me that way. There is so little sense and knowledge. It's sort of, I'm really ranting now, but it's sad. And maybe it's because, Mike, it may have something to do with where we are moving away farther and farther and farther away from a literate culture, and moving more and more and more, toward an oral culture. And so it's hard for everyone to remember everything, right? So people just kind of spew a lot, and whoever, I don't know,
Well, also, I feel though, we have no moral compass. There's no moral compass in this country anymore. Everything to me is a grift. What's in it for me, right? The families have been, I don't want to say destroyed, but you don't see the nuclear family.
Yeah, no, families have been destroyed, but that's by design. If you go back to Marx and you go back to Gramsci and you go back to the efforts of Stalin, of Lenin, efforts you can't have you can't be destroyed by communism if you have a strong nation state and if you have strong families. You just can't be. And this when the Russian Revolution first came off, and the revolutionaries were looking to sweep across Europe, one of the big problems was that there was just too much religion. There were too many strong families. I mean, I'm sort of simplifying, but this is a true thing. There was too much traditional society in these European countries at that time to accept this radical change. No marriage, no property, no this, no that. Things were just too solid. And what we've seen over the past 100 years has been this multi-vectored effort to undermine every single one of these institutions. And so each time one has gone down, you think, well, what's next? I mean, I did not know that we would go from homosexual marriage to the trans world. I wasn't seeing that coming. It was something I do remember that it seemed like it went in the space of, was it a year from where Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were defending a traditional marriage to not. And then it was like down, off to the races. And then, I think what is the trans world starts kind of coalescing around, I think it's 2014. People tend to date it to some Time magazine story or something, but it's like one thing after another. And you just think, how far does this go? And it goes pretty far. I think it does go toward that transhumanist world where human beings are not recognizable anymore.
Well, and you mentioned our lack of literacy, and it comes back to the short people's attention spans, and
Right.
they're just glued to their phones, which has all the information possible in that little device, but yet people are completely lost and completely sucked in like zombies.
Well, it's true. I mean, I think it would be, yeah, that's true. And the other thing that has been, and these are systematic changes. This is not just, oh, look what happened because people have phones. These are definitely programmable, understood kinds of changes. I've always heard that the Silicon Valley people don't let their kids use these technologies to the extent that everyone else in the country does because they understand what it does to their brains. But one thing that's also part of this period, and again, these are really only 20-year changes. They're not that old, a lot of these changes. When Facebook comes online, what you start to see is the attack on the sense of personal privacy, which becomes absolutely one of the big transformations of human behavior, I think, that we've had in all of our history, where things that once were private, whether it's a marriage proposal or having a baby or you name it, things that once were private are now, I don't even have to say it. They've been widely photographed and they're sent out to all your friends and your relatives and but what that does is it changes how you view your space, yourself, your boundaries. So that if the government says, hey, I kind of need to track you and I need to know you're this and you're that and this number and that number and where you're going, what you're buying, honestly, the kids and adults who've been conditioned by this are not going to see it as an issue. Whereas 20, 30, 40 years ago, privacy was a huge issue and it was a big right. So now we've just kind of signed that one over, which I think is sort of one of the big related stories of our time. This change in human behavior.
Well, and the idea that people have gotten more comfortable in the internet world than the real world. And I was referencing,
Wow.
some journalists that I follow on X, some of that I've had on, and to me, you can tell by their behavior and their posts that they're more comfortable in the internet world than they are in the real world.
Right. Right.
And
Well, again, yeah.
and that's the trend that it's gone to now, where people, like you said, I mean, I've seen people give birth, that day they're taking a picture
Yeah.
holding the baby, and it's on
Picture.
Twitter,
Yeah.
Instagram, everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's considered very normal. I mean, it goes on from, I mean, that's sort of the beginning of what's considered very normal to share. And that's a different kind of animal, that's just a very different kind of person and much more suited to the digital numerical transhumanist world. I think they probably, that had to happen because otherwise people would listen. It's kind of interesting. One of my favorite things to study or come across is when something changed. If there's some moment you can say, boom, that really was a big sea change. And one of them was, I think it was about 1965. There was a congressman. I think he had a funny name, like I think it was Cornelius P. or T. Gallagher, or something like that. He was the one congressman who seemed to be very concerned that there was some kind of computer going. It may have been connected to Princeton and the federal government, something where they were going to suddenly have a database that had people's driver's licenses and some basic records in a computer. And he was up a tree about how this was a huge invasion of privacy. The government would know, what your record was, in the military, whether you were divorced or whatever it was. And he was outraged. And I think it was a big moment in this. And again, also the introduction of the credit card, another one of these moments that truly revolutionized what kind of information individuals were comfortable with a corporation or a government having, your credit record. Well, that used to be private. What do you mean you want my credit record? If I'm going to do a transaction with you, perhaps, but this notion that it would just be something that could be shared and vetted and compared and all this stuff, all new. Isn't that something? I think it's part of, obviously the computer age makes all of these things viable and they would say necessary. But
and the ability now, because now they know your behavior, right? They know the way you shop because everything's done online.
Right.
And if the government wants to come in and they want to audit Diana West and look at what you've been spending, there's nothing you can do about it.
Right. Right. Because who's going to use cash for everything? You can't. I mean, you can't function online with it, certainly. Mail order catalogs, I've noticed, have stopped not all of them, but a lot of them have stopped having, the little order form where you could put in an envelope and send your check.
Well, and we've seen too, the lawfare that goes on where if the government does decide to come after you, and I've had, I had Peter and Lydia Brimelow of VDARE. They've been on here a few times, and they were one of the early groups that experienced it. And you have to hire an attorney, and they know this. They'll take you out to deep water, and you can't compete with a blank check.
No. And they're a perfect example of an independent voice that the central board, had to shut down. It's terrible.
And they were proven to be right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, they didn't do anything wrong. I mean, there was not even a crime. There was no crime.
No, but their messaging of, what Peter was talking about.
Yes, it was. Yes. Yeah. Alienation was always right, ahead of his time. And that was, a big tell in the conservative movement was ejecting him and some of the other immigration restrictionists back in the day. And this would have been something that goes down to the impact of National Review, which plays a really interesting role in a lot of these changes. It had this reputation. I don't think it does anymore, but for many years, a flagship of conservative thought. And darned if they didn't eject what you would now describe as the MAGA movement going back to, 1960 or so. They were internationalist in focus, and they did not want to have any more of these writers who were interested in America First type foreign policy, focus on domestic subversion, not communist, movements abroad, that kind of thing. My theory developed at a certain point after American Betrayal. I was looking at a lot of this stuff, and my theory developed that, there was this effort to create the Republican conservative wing of politics as this internationalist force that, to the detriment of looking at all the subversion and communist activity happening here. Those people were then castigated as kooks, right? They were the kooks, but the people who wanted to fight communism, 10,000 miles away, they became the leaders of the party. So it's kind of an interesting situation to contemplate if you're just judging actions and not words.
One of the things that you wrote about in your new recent book that I think is important were McCarthyism. How they
Mm-hmm.
took that word, because that's not what he was about, and they took it, and to this day, they're still using that word.
They're still using that word, yes, and that was something I discovered, again after American Betrayal, even after reading Blacklisted by History by M. Stanton Evans, which was really for me, when they asked that question, what book really upended your worldview or changed you? That for me came out about 2007, I think it was. That was my book, that upended everything. I knew nothing about Joseph McCarthy. I mean, really, basically a blank slate. I had this feeling he probably wasn't as terrible as everyone said, just because my own orientation. But that book showed me the lies that were entrenched by the secondary and tertiary sources and the media and the right and the left, but also the right against him, he was simply trying to uncover secret communists who were on the government payroll. I mean, this is the most reasonable kind of thing. There are people working for Stalin on the taxpayers' dime, right? In our in our security, the Defense Department or the State Department, wherever it was. It should have been something that they all wanted to do. It should have been, again, where's Congress? But the term of opprobrium, because McCarthy was one of the most popular men in America right up until his supposed fall, the censure vote, which was 1954. And they took this Stalinist directive that was in the old days, the what did they call it? They called it um, I'm trying to remember. There's a phrase for this notion of basically sending an idea along an assembly line or something like that. There might be another word, but they had these certain magazines and newspapers, like the Daily Worker, like a magazine called Political Affairs. There were some others where essentially the ideological goal of the day would be set. And you can go back, and this was the work of a very famous ex-communist named Louis Boudin's, who had been the editor of Daily Worker, and he traces back the origin of McCarthyism as a term of opprobrium from Stalin himself, from the communist parties, that would be it was moved into American media, and it lingers there to this day. And the thing that drives me nuts is when conservatives use it, and they're using it incorrectly. They're talking any kind of unfair persecution of a political figure is called McCarthyism. But he wasn't unfair. And the idea of it being a witch hunt is ridiculous because there were communists. If you assume there were no witches, there were communists. So it was not a witch hunt. It was not a persecution. It was something that needed to be done by a very fearless, courageous politician. And the other thing about that period that I think people should know a little bit about is there were other congressmen and senators, representatives and senators, very involved in this effort. McCarthy was the most prominent, but there were Democrats and Republicans both that were trying to get a hold of what had happened to this country, which I always think of as the original swamp. The original swamp was created in the 4 terms of Franklin Roosevelt to Truman, going from 32 through the 4 terms. He died in office, of course, and Truman took over. But in those 4 dominant Democrat years, that is where you get the original swamp. And when the Republicans took Congress after this, they are only just starting to get a sense of what was going on. And there were, again, also Democrats very upset about it as well, because they were anti-communists in those days. So this is something that is completely lost when you use that term and think that all you're doing is standing up for somebody's free speech, which is this ridiculous thing. And I always think Stalin must really be smiling at this continued fetish about McCarthy, because, I mean, God, the man, he died when he was 48 years old. And what is it? It's 70 years ago plus, and he's still being roasted like he's some kind of, some kind of horrible ceremony, death ceremony or something in American politics to this day.
The propaganda campaign in this case was successful. How they were able to.
Yes, and to add one thing, what is George Clooney doing right now? He is appearing in a stage production of his Murrow movie. So and about the McCarthy-Murrow contretemps. So it continues to be inserted into whoever, I don't know who goes to George Clooney on Broadway with his dyed hair, but he looks very strange. He's trying to be
He
Edward
does look.
Murrow.
He does look. He looks. I
He
saw an
looks
interview
really
with him.
old.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But who is going? But the effort is to keep that story going.
And at that time, when they pushed the propaganda, was there anybody at his defense, or did they all
Yes.
become complicit in all of it?
No, there were people who defended him, and again, he was very popular in the country. Yes, he had defenders, and he was very successful. It was a very complex. The takedown of Joseph McCarthy was a very complex, multidimensional um, theatrical event that took place as he was on the cusp of something very important. And I've always kind of wanted to go back to it because it was something I came to that I've not seen really written up much. And it had to do with he was looking, there was a series of hearings on a very sensitive military installation known as Fort Monmouth. It was signals intelligence and so on. And there were remnants of the Rosenberg ring involved, and there were a lot of security risks that the general at the time was trying to remove from this incredibly sensitive military work. And somehow they kept getting reinstated. And this was something that McCarthy was looking into as his role on the the subcommittee. And he was just at this point, there are news stories I found. I thought it was so interesting because it was like the hammer came down on him right after he was talking about subpoenaing very top Defense Department officials to explain how it could be that the general, his name's on the tip of my tongue, but the general at Fort Monmouth could request people be removed because they were dangerous given their backgrounds and so on. And just as he was announcing Pentagon hearings, you start seeing this massive full court press, literally, or I guess it's not really a press term, but basketball, right? But this full court effort, this total war on him that ended up in this very complicated thing called the Army McCarthy hearings, that then ends up in these censure hearings, and the whole thing was one giant complex takedown. But he was right on a very important, I think he was at a very important cusp. I've always kind of wanted to look into that a little further.
Was that a
Oh,
turn?
and one other thing, as a side, as a sort of he didn't have enough support, of course, because he was censured, but there was an admission in a memoir that Barry Goldwater, who was a senator at this time, he wrote years later, 20 years later, he wrote about Fort Monmouth because he was poo-pooed. McCarthy was poo-pooed. Oh, there's nothing wrong there. He didn't find anything, that kind of thing. Probably to this day. And the journalists who attacked him over it are lauded, that kind of thing. But Goldwater wrote in one of his memoirs that McCarthy was so right about the extent of the subversion at Fort Monmouth that the Army actually took all that sensitive work that was being done there and they took it out to Arizona and they built a new base for it. So, I mean, how much more confirmation can you get than that? There was a big problem there, and they literally moved it across the country to try to get away from the terrible subversion at this particular installation.
Do you think that was a turning point? Had that gone the other direction, and he was able to
Yeah,
get more of his footing and get the message out?
I do.
Where do you think we'd be at today?
I think he was a big turning point in a lot of things. I mean, you see a lot of very serious advances from the communist side after he was destroyed and died. He died very young, and I think the circumstances are strange. He went in for something relatively minor and died. The Naval Hospital. He's 48. But you see, Castro takes power shortly after. You see all manner of changes in the way changes in just the direction of the communist movement. You see the creation of the so-called new left, which really was just a generational change. It's the old left, but it was younger people that we call the 60s. They're very deeply connected to the old communist left, even though they claim to be very different. So you do see a change in the country after that. And I think also, even though the committees continue to be attacked, the investigating committees, House Un-American Activities, the McCarthy subcommittee, or what had been the McCarthy subcommittee as well. They did continue to do very good work in the 1960s, but it was under siege because of what had happened. And eventually they get ruled out of existence. So yeah, you see major strides after his demise.
Plus, too, and I asked I wonder this question I'm going to pose to you. Back then it was so much easier to suppress information, right? Because your outlets were newspaper, was television. When did television start?
Well, there's a lot of radio. There was national radio. The networks were radio until they were TV. I guess they started in the 50s. You can start seeing the news shows and so on starting in the 50s.
But because you had these limited outlets to get information out, it was much easier to contain. But it also, we look at where we're at today and your ability to, anybody can put information out there, but yet you can get suppressed so easily
Right.
that
Well, with the algorithms, yeah. I mean, I think that yes, there were. It's an I'd love to see a real, expert in new, literally, the sort of a forensic expert in journalism or something who could really talk about reach, because there were so many papers, and there were conservative papers and liberal papers, and there were morning papers and there were afternoon papers, and they had different editions. There was a lot of information going out there. It was a very vibrant business. I think it was an awful lot of fun back then, much different. And so it could be that information was better, and it was a smaller country, in terms of population. It could be information was disseminated in a better way. I don't know how to compare it exactly. It certainly wasn't 24/7. But on the other hand, I don't consume is the new word, right? I don't consume media anymore, and I don't really look except to see what they're on about or to see what they're creating. I used to get foreign newspapers a day. I lived in Washington, D.C. I used to, there were places you would go and you could get international papers and things like that. There was news that was much more seriously written as news, I do believe, even if it was slanted. Um, so we have a lot of information, but it's really hard to get news, that of a serious nature or a pressing nature. You get these stories and you get these news cycles and these deflections and all that. But so it may have actually been more effective back then, and it was a more literate population. I mean, if you go back ever and look on YouTube or something for some of the old, like 1950s Sunday talk shows, the level of conversation is quite high, certainly compared to what we have today. It's pretty interesting.
people are
Voices
going
are different. Yeah.
people people are going to ask me what books are you reading right now? I know you've mentioned a few that you've read in the past, but they always want to know like what people are reading.
Well, because there's been so much, that's another thing I should mention. I never thought I'd see. I never thought I'd see such casual and amplified anti-Semitism on media, whatever kind of media, in my lifetime. I never experienced it or saw it in any, throughout my life. And so as a result of some of this, I've studied it a little bit more. So I just recently read an interesting book. It's called Stalin Against the Jews by a Soviet slash Russian, I guess Soviet. He was a Soviet most of his life until the fall, but his name is Arkady Voxberg, and he's very, very it's a very interesting, difficult kind of book. And I recently read that. And I'll tell you something I learned. I learned that I think the word Zionist as a slur comes from Stalin, which I thought was quite interesting. The book is about how anti-Semitism was used, how Stalin was affected and was able to kind of use it in his. He was very anti-Semitic, which people don't always think about. They think of Hitler, right? Obviously, but Stalin apparently was preparing a Jewish solution for the Soviet Union right about the time he was dying, that was going to involve a mass ejection of Jews to some remote place and some incarcerations and so on, and that kind of thing. But what's fascinating is the insanity that gripped these leaders of that country, and in not just anti-Semitism, so many things, but he was focusing on this. Just the psychosis of these people is shocking, and the lengths they went to make murders look like they were accidents involving certain leading Jews at the time. There were some famous cases involving theater people and doctors and so on. Anyway, it's kind of in the weeds, I suppose. But on the other hand, I was struck by there are parallels to our day and the psychosis and animus that is evident at this point. So I was reading that. And I'll tell you what else I've been reading, which may be surprising. I have been reading a lot of poetry.
Please share. What are you reading?
Oh, I've been reading, well, Victor Hugo, and I've been reading Robert Browning, and I've been reading Ezra Pound. I've been reading the last couple of winters. Winter is big time for reading for me. And I just decided, the world is just doing what it's doing. And I need to get back to, stop reading all this really evil, negative stuff sometimes, and really get back to, I was an English major in college. And I just thought, I haven't read all these people. I haven't read these things. I need to get back to that. And it's been wonderful, I have to say.
Any Oscar Wilde?
I have not read him lately, no. Mm-mm.
You bring that up. I'm like, maybe I should go back and read some Oscar Wilde stuff.
Sure, sure, sure. I'll never forget his short story for children, The Happy Prince. I love that story.
I haven't read that.
Oh, it's a wonderful story.
He was. They used one of his lines. I've always been a big boxing person, and Muhammad Ali was in a documentary years ago when he was fighting George Foreman. At the end of the documentary, they'd asked him. The journalist was telling a story where he was speaking, and asked him for or they were talking about his fight career, and the Oscar Wilde quote was, "You destroy what you love," and they reversed it and talking about Muhammad Ali, "What you love destroys you," because he could never give up fighting.
Oh, golly. Yeah, that's interesting.
So you destroy what you love is the Oscar Wilde line, but it was the
Uh-huh.
reverse in this case, is what you love
Right.
destroys you,
Oh, dear.
which I thought was just,
Well,
it always great. That always, I just
kind of
associate
gripped
Oscar
you.
Wilde with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if people are literally interested in pursuing something that takes them away from that news cycle and their phone and everything, one thing I recommend is Project Gutenberg, which has the massive library of free books you can download. And the thing that I started doing, because a lot of this poetry is so hard, especially if you haven't been studying it and or never studied it, but there are all these really remarkable books, essays by English critics from, say, 1920 or 1900 or whatnot. You can download, and they will take you through these poems in the most. I mean, they're just as good as any class I ever had, or better. And I've really been enjoying that. And it's a great break from the insanity, and a way to get back in touch with what really matters. What also strikes me lately, Mike, is just how much time we devote to these terrible people in Washington. And I'm glad the Trump people are there, and they're definitely better than the last group. But just this idea that we wake up and we see, what are they doing today, like it's this reality show that we hang on. And there's something so life draining about this. And so you realize that people, who precede us are, certainly these are geniuses I'm talking about, but just generally speaking, people before, if you're looking for a better way to live, which I am, people had other inspirations and drivers besides keeping up with this horrible stuff we can never really unravel. And I think there's something so seductive about it. There's the internet, all the things we've been talking about are very powerful magnets, right? And and yet they are very dehumanizing at the end, of the experience, I find. So I don't know. I think some of these archives that you can get online, I'm sort of talking about the good thing of online, I think are great ways to get back in touch with our heritage. This is really who we are. We don't really want to be a product of MSNBC and whatnot. It's there's a way to sort of ground yourself that I think people are looking for, and that's one thing I've been doing.
Last question I want to ask you. The book. This is
Oh
Diana's
yes.
book, by the way, for people. I'm trying to get my hands out of the way of the cover so people can see it. But are you happy with how it turned out?
Yeah, I am actually. It's kind of it's my website. I had a website, dianawest.net, for I don't know how many years was it, 2007 to midnight on December 31st, 2023. And my host changed hands, or what do you call it? The server company. They changed hands, and the new owners didn't. They basically canceled my website. They didn't like my website, and it was I could have moved. Could I have moved it? It was kind of an antique architecture for a website. It was very difficult to just put it up on a WordPress. It wasn't doable, and I ended up copying and pasting it, which was kind of a lot to do, but I did it. So I have it, and it was in a computer. And then I just thought, it's really such a shame, because one thing that is nice about being an internet journalist, or a journalist in a time of the internet, is there is this access to your work, which is, you can find it if you need it, and other people can find it if you have a website or other way to access it. And suddenly all that was gone. And there was a certain relief to it. You sort of carry everything around like a tortoise shell or something. Everything's always there. So in a way, it was sort of nice that it wasn't all of a sudden, but I decided to go through and do sort of a first cut of some of the work I had done since 2016. Some of the longer essays, things that had really drawn my attention, and I spent time polishing, because it was a blog. Some things are lighter and faster than others, and I am happy with it. It is a good kind of a good overview of the events of the day and some of my own efforts. But the one thing that I will call attention to, because no one will ever see it, it's like anywhere. And that is, I don't know if you got to it, but that is the the right's anti-Trump lexicon, which is at the back of the book. And this is something I was creating in real time during Trump won, or the campaign, when the conservatives melted down, the GOP, the elite GOP, the rhinos, the mainstream Washington Republican Party, et cetera. It's before MAGA really was conjured out of the marsh and the muck by Trump, because everyone was dead. Basically, this whole voting block was over. So they were dominating. And when Trump started connecting with the people, they melted down. And you cannot believe the language that was used by mainstream conservative pundits and politicians. And I started making a record of it, because I was actually trying to write a quick book. I was supposed to write a quick book for St. Martin's, my publisher, and I couldn't do it that quickly. But I had the lexicon, which was supposed to have been a feature in it. So I commend people to the lexicon. It goes A to, I think it does get to Z, maybe not all the way to Z. Basically, it's A to W, but you can't even believe the language that is used. It's scatological, it's crazy, it's insane. And some of these people are serving in his administration at this point too, which is kind of funny.
I know I know we've been talking for a while, but one of the things that you pointed out early in all this, on one of your posts on X, where you're talking about. I mean, it's kind of unrelated, but it made me. It's been stuck in my head with Kash Patel when he gets sworn in, and his first words are, "This is so effing cool," and I'm just like, yeah. I mean,
He's a
yeah.
disaster. Yeah, yeah. No, I know. Well, yeah, yeah. That probably goes back to The Death of the Grown Up, my first book.
What did you think when you saw that?
Oh, well, I wasn't surprised. I don't think Cash is politically or temperamentally suited to run the FBI. And I also have a beef with him going back to Trump Russia when he was working for Devin Nunes's intelligence committee, because what they did was they baked in the biggest lie, the foundational lie of Trump Russia, which is that Russia hacked the DNC. Russia did not, there is no evidence that Russia hacked the DNC. And we were not told this. And the report, the final report, kind of slips it in that it did happen. And then as we exit the Trump administration in 2020, I think it was Richard Grenell declassifies a lot of stuff. And one of them is I don't know why it was, well, I kind of do now, but the closed door hearing with the head of CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike was the contractor that the DNC called in, not the FBI, which was weird right away, called in to check out what had happened to their server or what had happened to their computer system. And they admitted in those hearings, the closed door hearings, CrowdStrike, that they had no evidence. They had no evidence that Russia was involved in the hack of the DNC. This was the big lie that called into question. It supported the Trump is Putin's puppet. They never brought in the people like William Binney, whistleblower, who had alternate explanations of it was probably a download. They never looked into the murder of Seth Rich, the DNC young man who probably was WikiLeaks source on those emails, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, Kash Patel, I associate him and Nunes with this cover up. This was the cover up that went out with the Trump Russia investigation report. So I have never been a fan.
And people applaud him.
Yes, and people applaud him. And he temperamentally he doesn't seem suited for such a job. And what is he doing? He's out on the ocean with FBI and in life jackets and doing gun things and running around, and he hasn't done any of the things that need to be done to rectify the rot in that agency.
He was there when Ovechkin, right, didn't become the all-time whatever the hockey event he was at. He was at some sport. I've seen him at a couple UFC events too.
No, it's very strange. It's sort of like Trump got these action figures in his cabinet, like Kristi Noem, and they do these action figure type posing, and they're not actually doing. Pam Bondi would be, she's become the Fox News correspondent, not the Attorney General. And there is so much there I mean, frankly, all you really need to do to begin with at these cabinet level positions is declassify stuff. Not old JFK. I mean, honestly, we're not going to see, they've already destroyed whatever it is that needs to be destroyed with some of these old files, but just start declassifying records on, contracting in Iraq, or records on the J6 investigations, records on Trump Russia, just start declassifying, let alone my own historical interest records on our POWs and MIAs that
But you talk about that in the book, not to cut you off, but
Yes.
that's another thing.
Declassify. Yeah, and declassify. One of the things, I think I can pull it up quickly, is what an 80-year-old document looks like, if I can find it fast. What they consider a declassified document of people who are so dead and gone that this is a declassified can you see it? Up or down?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what a declassified FBI document looks like. Oh, that's really useful. I mean, and everybody, they're generationally gone. They're probably 3 generations of the family that are now dead and over with. And that's what they put out for a declass. These are the documents, the FBI, the investigations they were doing into the communist rings, which have never been fully exposed. So,
And this is where, kind of coming back full circle, because we talked, touched on this earlier, but people were literally clamoring for the Epstein. They were clamoring for Kennedy. And I had said, I was like, at this point, these things have been scrubbed so much. And whatever they put out, are you going to believe it anyway?
Well, the problem is if the CIA is holding documents, they're holding documents. And if they can say, oh, we gave you everything. And what are you going to do about it? I mean, the only way you could really declassify, and this would be my idea, the way is that you have a raid on the CIA, and you basically like an old prohibition style raid or a gambling house raid where you say, everyone step away from your desk, and you cuff them and you take them out, and then you can start seeing what they really have. But you can't ask them for things and expect that they're going to go and really give you the crown jewels. They don't do that. They destroy them or they hide them. So it's all kind of a game. And I think it was, again, to take our eye off the ball, which was about draining the swamp. And, while certainly the Epstein records pertain to that, that's not coming out. I mean, look at that court case for Ghislaine Maxwell. No, nobody was identified in that. That's done. That's done. And that it probably has something to do with the Clintons, et cetera. That's just not, it's just not happening, and it's terrible, but we have a lot to address. And it's not being addressed either, even as they're sort of dangling these sort of big ticket items in front of us.
And the Sean Diddy Combs. I mean, that's another one. And I just read that his trial is getting delayed.
Yeah.
We're never going to know. If there was anybody, if there's anybody of any consequence that was part of that, we're never going to know.
It feels that way. It feels that way. And it doesn't seem to be high on the list of what these officials are motivated for. And, I personally would, trade a lot for, how about Trump's assassination attempt records?
Wouldn't he want to know that? I mean, he probably already does, but
I don't know. I don't know what he knows. We assume he knows. He's running a big thing. I don't know what he knows. I don't know what they tell him, but the American people should know, and Trump, of course, but it's not private information. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there, I am sure. And why is that not a priority? Contemporary things that are burned. One thing, and you may want to wrap up with this because it's such a great quote, but Solzhenitsyn had this frustration, obviously, with the West, but he said it is as if, and this is a little bit of a paraphrase, so I probably can't quote it exactly, but he said it is as if the West does not want the information until it is too late to do anything about it. And I think that pertains to a lot of the way scandals and seizures of government power and so on are handled. They hold back, they keep the information, they keep the names until you get to a generational point where maybe they'll let it out and there might be some boutique scholarly interest or fun trivial pursuit type interest in it, but the war is over. And that is how they manage us with information. It's never released in a timely fashion where you could say, you're going to jail, and do something about it. It's such a frustration, but it's been going on a very long time.
Yeah, and I didn't watch this, but people were talking about, I guess Glenn Beck was on Steve Bannon yesterday, and the context of it was, people need to be arrested, people need to be held accountable. I surrendered that fact even after, I didn't think Trump would win, but I never thought I'd see Obama get arrested or Fauci or.
No, and in this particular atmosphere where Trump, I think, is in such shaky, not shaky support with the American people, but shaky support or shaky security. I worry for him. I don't think that's necessarily where he should be. What he should be doing is sending out, arrest teams or something like that. I think that in a way is very bad advice, even though we want to see obviously justice done. But just the exposure itself is a big step toward clearing the air and making a better world possible. But the secrets stay hidden, and that is how the swamp perpetuates itself, by hanging on to these secrets and holding them over people, etc. So it's a terrible thing when declassification is just not a free-for-all. It should just be let it rip. There's nothing, certainly much of this stuff that has no operational value, but even the terrible things like the assassination documents or the J6 let it open it up. Why don't we have the names and numbers of all the federal informants, assets, what do they call them? Confidential, human, whatever. All those people who were at January 6th at the Capitol fomenting that disturbance. Why don't we have their names? Why don't haven't they been cleared out of the service? We don't, but they're not even looking at it. So that there are important figures in the Trump world that are trying to secure the swamp for the future. And that's, so disturbing. You don't really know where to go with that.
Last question, Diana. We've talked now for an hour and a half.
Okay.
How do you feel about what we've talked about, and then in the near future and long term?
Well, I'm worried about the summer. I'm worried that there will be a lot of unrest. So I guess I'm worried. You can put me down as worried, concerned. There's so little backstopping. There's so little response to some of these outrages we've been talking about, and just looking at the way the cities have been turned over to all the Palestinian protests and so on. There's no, you wonder, don't people have to get permits anymore? Are they really allowed to obstruct traffic? Are they really allowed to, there's just no, I think that there is support for this by powers that be in these different localities, which is disturbing. So concerning and alarming. So this is kind of where we are, I think, looking at what our near-term future can be. We might see a lot of unrest in the near term. So it's very alarming.
I didn't mean we would talk an hour and a half like I want this conversation to end. I just meant like
what
we've talked about for the last 90 minutes, covering both the past, present, and future.
Yeah.
I tell you what, my most concerning. See, I don't worry about the unrest standpoint. I worry about the economic where we're at. Because if people start losing, like what you've seen over the last couple of weeks with people's retirements and 401ks and whatnot dropping. I mean, I remember 2008 and people, they just lost it, panicked, and, emotions run high, and people could just, go unrest in terms of that. So I guess, I worry about the unrest on that point and from that standpoint.
Well, it's there are a lot of shifts taking place. I mean, we saw that in COVID as well. We saw plummeting economics as well.
Because we live on debt. We live on debt. People don't save money.
Right. But they want us to, I guess. They want us to
live on debt.
Yeah. Yeah, it's encouraged. I grew up in that ethos, I guess. And when I've read, for example, Ezra Pound, I was talking about him as a poet, but he had very strong ideas about economics. And his main idea was this idea that people should have a little homestead, a land. They shouldn't have to pay a mortgage for all their life. This whole system was designed to keep people in thrall and service to these these kind of hamster cage existences. And that was one of his big ideas. It drove him, I think, quite hard in his life. And when you think about it, and then he ties it to American history and points at which the banks become so important, and the way of issuing money changes, and you end up with debt, and oh my goodness, it all serves the Bank of England kind of stuff. It's very compelling, because why is that the case? Why do we have so many fees that we have to pay for this and that, these ridiculous, there's so much rigged in terms of enslaving people with debt and just monetarily speaking. So it's not a good system. It's a terrible system.
And yet you have to pay property taxes on a house. You never own your house.
I know. It's horrifying when you think about it. I think most people, they grow up not thinking about it. And so you just, that's what you do. And you're always kind of pressed by your mortgage, and that's okay because you have your house, but you don't really. And it's when you actually think about it, what a thing. And I remember an old timer reporter I knew, Tom Kelly. He was the father of Michael Kelly. He was a pretty famous reporter who died in Iraq, tragically. But Tom was an old timer, and I remember he was telling me about Washington D.C. back in the day, and he said that he didn't get married until to Michael's mother until he could buy his first house, and he bought his house. And you just think, what is the economic system that permitted a young man, a reporter, he wasn't wealthy by any stretch, but he saved money and he was able to get into, I think, without a mortgage. Prices were just different. The scales were different. Everything was just different. And one of my, we haven't talked about this. One of my sort of bugaboos, I guess that's a silly word, but one of the things I look at is the effect of the two-career household on prices. Because it used to be you could be a writer, you could be a freelance writer, and you could support a family if you were, reasonably successful. You could support a family of four. You could. And I remember once going to a lecture about this subject. I think it was the writer Jody Bottom was talking about this. He'd done some research, and it was kind of an amazing thought that you could be a newspaper man, you could be a freelance writer, whatnot. You could have a wife who didn't work, and you could support a couple kids, and you could live a life on this kind of money, which today is not feasible unless you're, one of a very select few people. And it's kind of an interesting thing. But once women come into the workforce en masse, you see a lot of certain industries start to be feminized, writing, things like that. A lot of women go into, and the prices drop. And then you see, women in medicine, for example, sharing one job so they can, have the prices go down. And so it is a free market issue, I think, that changed our economics. Houses are priced according to what a couple can buy. Well, if two couples are making good money, right, it drives a lot of our problems monetarily, which I think is an interesting subject.
Well, people leverage their future so they can live rich instead of trying to gain wealth.
Yes, there's that as well. Yeah.
I mean, I look back to my grandparents. My parents grew up in the 50s, or my mom was born in the early 50s. And, back then, my grandfather dropped out of high school because he had to go to work.
Right.
My grandmother was born in the Great Depression. She wasn't a Rosie the Riveter. She worked like in an accounting office at a tank manufacturing plant. But
Yeah.
If you were a young couple in the 50s, you'd have 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. The father would go to work, and you still had money. I mean, there was enough money that everybody could eat.
Yeah. No, it was way, way more civilized.
One car.
Yeah, one car. Yeah, my dad dropped out of high school. He dropped out of high school. He went to work on the MGM lot before he got drafted for World War II. That was what he wanted to do. And my mom didn't finish college either. She was an actress. So, yeah, people had different ways. Everyone is very regimented now. We're very, we have to have, oh my gosh, this, student debt, etc. I mean, the people and start life behind the 8 ball, and that's where they stay. So it's, I don't know what our new system that Scott Bessent has in mind. I haven't seen what he's talking about. It doesn't sound very good, but it's I don't know. I think if I were a young person today, I would probably want to find a farm that I could raise something that probably would remain, could still live that way and be as self-sufficient as possible.
I wouldn't, I went to college, and I have this conversation with friends of mine who have kids that are getting ready to go to school. And I mean, they don't really ask my opinion, but yeah, I wouldn't send, if I had a child, I wouldn't send them to college. There's no value in it. And I was talking to a guy a couple of weeks ago at the gym. He's like 20 years old, and he dropped out. And he goes, I mean, these professors, they can't keep up with these kids. They cannot keep up technology-wise. The high school teachers can't keep up with these kids.
Yeah.
And you're going to send your kid to school, put them in debt. I mean, I went to Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. It's $30,000 a year now to go there.
Right.
They want to enslave you right from the get-go, and then you go to a corporate job, and you hate your life. You're sitting at this desk. You can't speak. Yeah. They don't want to hear your ideas.
Right. Or you're remote.
So that way they can easily axe you if they need to.
Right.
Who wants to do and people push back, like, the older people push back and they say, well, life isn't about doing what you want to do. I'm like, yeah, no, I get it. I get it. But you shouldn't go to work hating your job. You should, if you're going to go to college
No.
and just sit there, like, and not learn anything, what kind of life skills are you going to accumulate?
Yeah. No, yeah, I think it's more about putting us in boxes and, the whole control idea, I think is very much part of this. And yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not, I mean, there's a difference between being a hedonist and finding something that's satisfying and worthwhile doing that can support you. And if you have to work a job that, lets you uh, express yourself, where you're not going to get paid as much, that's okay too. But you have to find something to do that is not so dehumanizing. Again, I guess a lot of what we've been talking about are these efforts to dehumanize people, humans. So it's something people really need to be thinking about, how
I,
to stay human.
my last thing I was going to tell you. See, we keep talking, Diana. This is why you got to come on more regularly than every
I
five, six
know, I
months.
know.
My friend Matt Smith, who he's been on here a few times, and he's writing a book with his son and this commodities expert, Doug Casey, and it's called The Preparation. So his son he might be 20 years old now, but he didn't go to school. And he started his preparation, this journey to with EMT to go. He went to EMT school,
Okay, I
and then
know
from
so.
there it led him to fight wildfires in Oregon.
Uh,
Now his father Matt
yeah.
lives in Uruguay. He's got a ranch in
Uh-huh.
Uruguay. So Maxim, his name is Maxim, has learned how to become a rancher. Then he
Uh-huh.
went to, I think he went to Chile or somewhere to do parasailing. Learn how to be to parasail. Now he's back. He's going to fight wildfires again this summer, but he's also getting his private pilot's license.
Oh
Learning how to,
wow. Yeah.
so he's doing all these things to acquire
Yeah.
life skills.
Yeah. It's fantastic. He sounds like a big adventurer. That's great.
Well, and where does Matt had said, he
Yeah.
goes, I don't know where it's going to lead him, but
Right.
and this is what the book is all. I can't wait to read the book. It hopefully comes out this
Yeah.
summer, but it's called The Preparation, and his son
Okay.
has been he's on Substack. Maxim's on Substack, and he has the
Well,
Preparation is also on Substack, but he's been journaling, his weekly journals and putting on Substack of what he's doing.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
Matt was talking about, he goes, yeah, you go to college. He's like, I went to college and I went to college. You're around a bunch of people because it was like, well, you want to be around people your own age, which, yeah, you want some people to be around around your own age, but older people is where you gain experience. They'll
Right.
help you.
Right. Right. And you get indoctrinated and made a crazy person in college.
Well, you're around a bunch of, you're a moron when you're 18. I was a moron when I was 18. So now you're around a bunch of other morons.
Right. Right.
What's that
Yeah.
going to
It's
do
not
to prepare you
healthy.
for life?
Oh, I know. I know. No, I agree. See that's the kind of that book will, I hope, will be influential on young people. And I know a young man also who is doing the EMT thing, and he's doing it in the wilds of Canada. He's way up north. So, there are still adventurers. There are people who really want to connect with life. And, it sounds sort of silly, but I think it's a great thing.
Well, then you become
Anything
a
that makes
resource, and you become a resource too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You become very important in your wherever you end up. You'll be very important. Yeah.
All right, last
And
question.
what confidence it gives you too to have those kinds of skills.
Last question, Diana. I promise is the
Yeah.
last question. So what about for young girls? What would you suggest?
And in navigating these same problems.
Yeah, like for young men to not go to college, would you say the same
Yeah.
thing for young girls? And if they don't, what should they do?
Hmm. Well, that's a hard question. Young girls, yeah, I think young girls probably shouldn't be necessarily going to college. I mean, back in earlier times, very few people went to college. It was more of a special thing. It wasn't just elitist. It might be people who really wanted to be doctors, needed to go to college, things like that. But now college is high school, right? It's just a continuation of the party. What should young girls do? It's a hard time. I mean, dating is hard. You've got these apps, you don't meet people. I feel like young girls, we've always been worried for many years, people, especially conservatives, have been worried about the boys, right? The war on boys, etc. And I worry about the girls now because I think that the pressure of society has sort of turned itself onto womanhood and girlhood in such a profound way, um, essentially erasing girls and women. I mean, this whole trans movement with the sports, especially, having encouraged girls to play all these sports they were never interested in before, right? To try to get them all to be athletes because we're all equal. Well, okay, you create this whole movement, and now you're telling them that, oh, but by the way, you have to compete with boys, and it's so much worse than that. But it's almost I've heard this discussed. I can't remember her name, but I've heard somebody talking about this is about the erasure of women, and it plays into the transhumanist future, whereby reproduction at some point will, they say, go into some sort of pod or something. There'll be a machine essentially that will be incubating babies, and women become less and less important. I think young women especially, are the endangered group right now, and I don't know exactly how to answer that question quickly. I would really have to think about that, and but what the 18-year-old or the 16-year-old girl should be doing. It's a difficult thing because the society has, in my first book, Death of the Grown-Up, I talk a lot about the sexualization of children and so on. And girls suffer the most from this. This is something when everything kind of hit the skids back in the 60s with manners and mores. I remember my mother at some point, it would have been later, but telling me that it's girls who suffer, with this kind of living together and so on, because the man moves on and gets married and the girl very often doesn't. And I think that's where we are as a society. I think there's a tremendous neglect and lack of concern of what Marxism and so on and Islam have done to girls. So I don't have a good answer. I'll try to come up with a good answer for you next time, but I don't have a good, oh, well, they should. I think your friend and his son are doing good things, and that is what boys should be doing. I'm not sure that girls can go and, fight fires and do that kind of thing. Not very many. So somewhere else they need to reassert femininity and their place. As I remember our pediatrician, we had a wonderful pediatrician telling me that girls who grow up into women are they carry on the civilization. And if girls and girlhood have kind of been destroyed, no one is carrying that forward, the tradition. So that has to be something conservatives especially really focus on.
Well, and also too, what do I know? But in terms of the attention that they get from the social media versus real world, right? Where OnlyFans and Instagram and TikTok and putting these revealing photos, video,
it's prostitution. It's a virtual prostitution, and it's encouraged and it's normalized. That's one word I don't think we use today. It's one of my favorite thoughts, is this idea when you're normalizing all of these, immoral or damaging behaviors, that is such an assault, again, on humanity, the humanness of people. So yeah, that's another aspect of this, and you see it everywhere. So it's a tough question.
Diana, where can people find you?
Well, at this point, you can find me at Real Diana West on Twitter, and I have a Substack, also Real Diana West on Substack, and I have a Patreon, Diana West. So I think that's where I am these days.
Where can people contribute? Also buy your book, your other books.
Yeah, they're all Death of the Grown-Up, American Betrayal, The Red Thread, and which actually is relevant again. The subtitle is A Search for Ideological Drivers Inside the Anti-Trump Conspiracy. So this was a book I put out, kind of long-form journalism back in 2019, but believe me, it's back. But everything and the new book, Wake Up and Smell the Culture, are available on Amazon, including audiobooks of The Red Thread and American Betrayal.
Is it better?
And I read them myself. So audiobooks.
Well, you have such a great voice, though. I would just... Yeah, wouldn't be the same if somebody else did it. Is it better to order on Amazon, or is it better to go through your website, or?
Amazon. Yeah, I don't have an organization to deal with that at this point, but yeah, Amazon. As much as we all hate Jeff Bezos and all that, yeah, that's where they are, and that's where I created the audiobooks. So yeah, that's where they are.
There's a bookstore in Phoenix that I used to go to. It was called Changing Hands. I have no problem outing them here, and I would drive down. It's a cool bookstore. They have a little coffee, cocktail bar, and this is before COVID. I miss
bookstores. Yeah.
And it was just one of those places like you go down, you can hang out and get a book or whatever, and but they are so anti-Trump, And
Yeah.
the owner was not, she didn't hide the fact on her social media. And I'm like, you know what? I'm driving 25 minutes to go get a book from you. Now it's, again, yeah, I'm ordering one book. It's not like I'm ordering thousands.
Right. Right.
I'll just make it easy on myself. I'll just say, Amazon, bring it right to my door. And I won't have to drive, a round trip 40 minutes to support you.
Right. Right. I understand that. Yeah.
Diana, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. I look forward to
Thank you.
continuing to follow your work and more conversations ahead.
Okay. Sounds great.
Mic
Thank you
drop.
so much, Mike. Bye.